Welcome to the studio.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Trey, this play was partly inspired by a conversation you had with your late grandmother.
Yes.
What was that conversation about?
My grandmother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And at that time, I was reading a book called The Five Regrets of the Dying. And I really had this urgency to capture my grandmother because she was such an integral part of my life. And I remember asking her, I said, Grandma, like, what is one of your biggest regrets? And she said, my biggest regret is leaving my children behind in Jamaica when I went to England. And she said, especially your mother, because she has never forgiven me for that.
Hmm.
And that was something that I had never heard my grandmother ever speak about her past. She wasn't a person who spoke about her emotions. She was a very stoic woman. And I remember when I showed my mother this clip, my mother broke down crying. And my mother said, I never knew that's how she felt. And I could see that my mother had this wound she also was carrying. And that's when I started to say, okay, I need to really explore this legacy in my own family.
I have to back up a second. That's a big question to
Yeah.
ask your grandmother. Why did you feel like that was the moment to ask her that question?
I think when someone's dying, there's this level of urgency that you want to capture everything. And my grandmother and I, we were very close. We had a really great relationship, sometimes in that the dysfunction, of course. But I felt I really wanted to know about her. And I think because I'm a writer, I really want to capture oral history. And for me, I was just like, I may not have this moment again. And I need to
It's
know.
great that you had the
Yeah.
chance. Yeah.
Yes.
So tell me about the relationship between your grandmother and your mother. How long was she away from your mother?
My grandmother was away from my mother for 6 years, and so she ended up leaving my mother in Jamaica when she was 6 years old, and then my mother came to England when she was 12. And so even in that, when they were together, even as adults, like I've always felt that there was this tension. There was always this kind of I think that they never seemed to be able to express emotions. I played a lot of kind of like the mediator between them. There was this distance. And I think, too, when my mother came from Jamaica, my grandmother then was the mother of 6 children in total. And so my mother was the oldest at that time. And so a lot of things were placed on her responsibility. And I think my grandmother was in survival mode, that she came to England thinking it was this land of milk and honey. And really what it was a place where she had to work really hard to provide for her children. And she didn't have time to be this lovey-dovey, let's talk about emotions, let's do this. It was kind of like, I'm putting food on the table and here's clothing on your back. Let's get this going.
And that's a common experience back then. That was a common experience back then. And it's still a common experience today.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Now, later, your mom left you behind at a certain point to find work in England. What do you remember about that time that she was away?
Yeah, my mother left me. I was in England and I was left with my grandmother, and my mother came to Canada. And I was left behind, my brother and I, for 4 years. And if there's one thing that I do remember very clearly, and this is like many therapy sessions later as an adult, it was just this feeling of being a young girl. I was left from ages 9 to 12.
So
And
similar
very
ages to
similar,
your mom.
and I think it's just this legacy, right, of what happens, right, of how, and the cycle of what we continue and what we know. And I remember just being 9 years old, and especially as a young Black girl, of getting my hair combed. And my grandmother wasn't good at combing hair, and so she used to send me over to a neighbor who would comb my hair. And I remember just sitting there as my neighbor she would braid her children's hair first and then braid mine. And this left something in me that kind of said, I'm always left behind. I'm the last one. And then I also remember, like, when you're 9 years old and you're a young girl and you're developing, getting my first bra, my mother wasn't there. Getting my period, my mother wasn't there. And it left this thing for me that thought, if my mother hasn't chosen me, then who else is going to choose me? And I always felt like I was that person who everyone knew who didn't have a mother.
Both you and your mother, as I said, in those formative years, 9 to 12, you're going through so much developmentally. And you said your grandmother cared for you?
Yes. My grandmother was very instrumental in my life. And so I think because also my mother had me at age 17, my grandmother stepped in very much as the maternal figure in my life. So I feel she was the person who I went to for any sort of guidance at that time, who I should approach for around advice. And so my mother kind of she was in the backdrop of my life. And it wasn't until my grandmother passed that I feel my mother and I were able to really reconcile as mother and daughter. And I think, too, because there was this huge distance of the time that she missed out on my life. And so I don't think we ever recovered from that. And so even in the play, what we explore is that whole thing around what happens with the years in between and how are you able to capture that, and how this mother and daughter wasn't able to recover from that distance.
To get that time back.
Yeah, that time back.
Yeah. Now, the irony in all this is that your mother and your grandmother before her left their children because they loved them.
Yes.
But that must be impossible to understand at that point.
Yeah.
At what point did you begin to understand that love was actually motivating this action?
I think for me, it was when I started to actually go down and explore motherhood for myself. And also, too, I started to do a lot of therapy. I also started to meditate and do a lot of reading, and it was around forgiveness. And I think what happened to me, and I think a lot of us suffer from that, for me, it was I had this checklist of who my mother should be. And my closest relation to the ideal mother was, Felicia Rashad on The Cosby Show. And my mother didn't measure up, right? So I had this checklist, and I was like, well, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you didn't do this, so therefore you can't be a good mother. And it wasn't until I was able to kind of started to separate my mother from being my mother and just being a human being, then I was able to do a lot more forgiveness with her. Like I had to start to look at and say, she was a 17-year-old having a child. She herself wasn't mothered properly. How can you then expect her to mother efficiently? And it became something that I was able to be a lot more forgiving of my mother, a lot more gentle with my mother. And funny enough, it was after my grandmother passed, we were able to have various conversations, because I think my mother started to look at and say, I don't want to have the same relationship that I had with my mother with you. And I think both of us came to this truce of saying, let's really actively work on being a better mother and daughter dynamic.
Was anything, it's hard to phrase this question right, but was anything gained from that experience of separation? Did you become, you became close with your grandmother? Were there other families you bonded with, or I don't know, a sense of independence at an early age? Were there any positives, upsides to that separation?
Definitely. I feel like people always say to me, like, you're so independent, you're such a go-getter. And I think it's because I knew from ages 9 and onwards, right, that I had to do a lot of stuff for myself. And sometimes that can be something that is really good, and sometimes that can be something that's not that great. And I think I've always been that person of like, well, if someone's not going to do it for me, then I'll do it and I'll go and get it myself. I also think because there was a lot of movement in my life, and I had to show up at different places and took on a lot more responsibility, I became a very responsible person. And so, but I also feel like I missed out on a lot of my childhood, because I feel even though my grandmother stepped in as the maternal figure, I also then started to really mother my brother because I was the oldest. And so there was a lot of things I think for myself that I had to figure out and let go and just be like, my childhood is what it was. And I think for many years I wanted to hold on to what I wanted my childhood to be, and instead of saying this is what it was, and you move on and embrace it. Yeah.
What about your involvement with art? Do you think part of that was inspired by that experience?
Oh, for sure. I always say, if my family wasn't dysfunctional, I wouldn't have anything to write about. If we were the perfect little family, there is no way I would be sitting across here with you right now, because I write from that place of pain. I write from that place of honesty and emotions. But in that, I would love to say my family is a very comedic Caribbean family. My mother's funny without even knowing it. My grandmother is funny without knowing it. And so even when I go to family gatherings, all of them are like, don't say nothing in front of her because it will end up on stage, right? So they know that that's who I am and what I do. And so I think it's this wonderful balance in my writing of the comedic, the pain, the healing, the questioning.
Hmm.
And for me, that has been really essential to my career. Like, I put my family on stage and people relate because they're like, no, that's not just your mother. That's my mother. That's not just your grandmother. Oh my goodness, you must have grew up in my house. And I feel that is a way to say we're all in this together.
Now, as part of your research for the play, you spoke to a number of Afro-Caribbean women about how mothers express love for their daughters.
Yes.
What did you learn through that?
When I interviewed a lot of these women, a lot of them, when I talked about saying to their children that if they loved them, I was really surprised at how many mothers said, oh, yeah, I say it. And then I would then interview their daughters, and their daughters were like, no, my mother's never told me I love you. And I was just like, I don't think they thought they were lying. Like, I really don't think there was, they were intentionally lying. But I think maybe in their head, in the way they expressed stuff, they thought that they were saying that they loved their children. Then there were some women who said, I don't need to tell them. I think by me showing up, by them having clothing and a roof over their head, they must know that I love them. And then there was a direct quote, what I took from one woman, and I put it in the play. She said, I carried her for 9 months. I pushed her out by myself. She must know that I love her. What more do I need to do? And so that was something that I found quite eye-opening, is how these women said, this is how I show my children that I love them. And I don't need to tell them. They know it.
How did that make you feel? You're a writer. You understand the power of words.
Yes. I think it made me feel, in a sense, of more understanding around my own mother. And I also think it was really important for me to, as I was talking to these women, I said, why don't you tell your daughter right now you love them? And I could tell they got a little choked up, and some of them, it seemed very hard for them to even articulate that to their daughters who were sitting right next to them. But I could see how healing it was for a lot of these women to publicly hear their mothers say, I love them. And even now with my own mother, I think in the last 4 or 5 years, we're starting to say, I love you more. And even when my mother says it now, I'm kind of like, oh, okay. I get a little nervous, right?
It's something new.
It's something very new. And my mother, her favorite thing, what she'll say instead of I love you, she was like, okay, all right, be good. Be good, right? And I know that's her way of saying I love you. So sometimes I'm like, okay, Mom, I love you. Okay, be good, nice, right? And she'll say that. And so I know that's her way, right?
And of course, there's an intergenerational piece to that too.
Yes,
Right?
definitely. My nephew was just born. I have now a 2-year-old nephew. And I think it changed us as a family, that we became much more softer and gentle with this little being, because we realized that he needed that love. And all of us say it. Now, my mother is like the first one to pick up this little boy and kiss him all over and like, Grandma loves you, Grandma loves you. And he says it all of the time. Like, he'll leave me little voice notes and say, Auntie Trey, I love you. And I feel like that has really changed us as a family and as a generation of women.
Well, breaking that is
Yes.
amazing.
Oh, it is amazing. And
Wow.
that's one of the things that I really wanted to do as an aunt, as someone who's considering motherhood right now. I really wanted to be much more emotional and much more verbal with my words and showing my love to even not just my family members, but to friends, to people that I work with, to be much more expressive with my emotions and love.
You said that seeing footage of your grandmother really affected your mom. How has seeing this play affected your mom?
My mother came out to the workshop reading, and because I'm directing the piece and I'm not in it, it was the first time I was able to kind of sit side by side with my mother in the theater. And my mother, from start to finish, cried. And my mother, I could tell you, Shad, is the type of person I can count on one hand how many times my mother has cried. And to see her in a public space just cry and cry, it really was very healing, I think, for her. I think for her, there was a level of understanding that occurred for her. And it was also someone finally giving her a place to say, this was my truth. And I think in that, my mother also will say, "Oh, look at you putting my business on stage." But there is a level in her, I think, of thank you, right? And
Mm.
she might not say that, right? Because that's another thing, right? She won't say thank you, right? But she'll say, "It was good. It was nice," right? Right? And that's her way of saying she's proud of me. Because it's so funny when I bump into people, they will say, "Oh, your mother's so proud of you. She's always talking about you." But my mother doesn't say that. She won't say to me, "Oh, I'm proud of you," as my daughter. She'll be like, "It was nice. It was good. You're good."
Old habits die hard.
Yeah.
They die hard. But you heard something healthy in her crying. Yeah.
Yes. And I think that's what I needed to hear, and that's what I wanted to see. And I think that's why it took me 6 years to get this play and finally debut it, because I wanted to make sure the story was authentic. I wanted to make sure the story was right. And that's why I interviewed all of these women. I interviewed these mothers and daughters because I wanted to make sure that I knew that I wasn't just telling a tale
Hmm.
that was about my mother and grandmother. It was other women who had this experience. And even, I had friends um, who are Filipino nannies. They were talking about when they came to see the play, how much this story affected them. Just yesterday I was in a taxi with a driver who was from Romaine. And he was like, "What are you working on?" And I told him about from Romania, and I told him about the play, and he was like, "I left my son and my wife in Romania for 6 years," and he goes, "My son has never forgiven me," and he said, "I don't think me and my son have the same relationship ever that we would have had if I had stayed," and you know.
It's interesting. We have a lot of conversations, especially these days, about immigration, about refugees, but we
Yeah.
don't necessarily talk about how the economic pressures and how
Hmm.
migration affects relationships on that
Yes.
family
Yes.
level. Is that something you're hoping to contribute to the larger conversation we're having about immigration?
Definitely, because I think what we always focus on is, well, they came for a better life and apparently they got a better life. But no one talks about the emotions that happen. Nobody talks about the scars that happen as a child who's left behind. Nobody talks about when you're actually reunited. And a lot of times with these women, especially, you're leaving behind children who are 6 and 7, and then they're showing up as teenagers, right? And it's hard enough raising a teenager. So imagine raising a teenager now who you had no contact with. That teenager is also trying now to assimilate into a culture that they do not know. They're trying to get to know you as a parent. There's no surprise that it sometimes all falls apart and it
Hmm.
doesn't become the best thing or the best scenario that you thought of. And
And
then,
as you mentioned earlier, the parents still have the intense economic pressures, so they
yes.
don't have all that time to parent.
They just don't. Even I
Yeah.
know when I came from England, I was used to being with my grandmother and extended family and all having dinners together around a dinner table. That was my grandmother's thing. Every evening at 6 o'clock, we have dinner together. When I came from England to Canada, my mother was working 3 jobs. And I remember just specifically being in the kitchen making, shake and bake chicken for my brother, sitting watching Oprah by myself. Family dinners just didn't happen anymore because my mother just didn't have the time to do that.
What are you hoping audiences take away from watching this play?
As I was writing the play, the one thing that kept coming up for me over and over again is I wish to forgive because I want to be forgiven. And I think we need to really function from this place of forgiveness. I realize for me, the only way my mother and our dynamic has changed is because I decided to forgive her, but also forgive myself in my own judgment of her. And I wanted to be just a kinder and softer and gentle person with my mother. And in kind, she then responded to me in that way. And I'm really hoping that audiences will walk away from this and say, okay, who in my life do I need to forgive? How can I really be a better person and be kinder to my loved ones, and especially our mothers? Because I think we all get carried away with the Hallmark Mother Days card, and some of us don't have that. And when we don't have that, we keep thinking, then what's wrong with me?
Hmm.
What's wrong with my mother? What's wrong with me? Instead of just saying, we're really doing the best that we can. And I think once I started to look at my own mother and say, she did her best. This was her absolute best. I was able to be in a better space with her and love her in a different way.
Final question: there's a lot of young girls coming out to see
Yeah.
the debuts.
Yes.
Why is that important to you to bring out a younger audience?
For me, it was really important. We're doing this initiative called 200 Girls, and we're doing it with TD Bank. And it was really important because I grew up in Toronto housing. I never got to see a professional theatrical production until I was in my 20s. And that really changed my life. And I think for these women, these young girls who are coming out, to see a play done by a diverse cast, produced by me as a Black woman, and stories that they can relate to by them, for them, I think it will really change their lives and it will open up whatever they feel is their reality. And
Mm.
so for me, it was really important to have these young girls come out.
So great to have you here, Trey. Thank you for
Thank
sharing your
you
story.
so much, Shad. Thank you.